The universe of BattleTech is vast, both in terms of the scope of its lore, as well as just how much of a quantifiable media presence it has. It's a 23-year-old franchise that, since its release as a board game in 1984, has grown to include books, card games, role-playing games, an animated television series, and probably most importantly, video games. I say most importantly because for a franchise that's only a year younger than Warhammer, it seems to me that it never really managed to get the same sort of popularity as its fantasy and later grimdark science fiction cousins did, except perhaps in the world of mid-90s video games. In fact, I'm willing to wager that many, if not most fans of the franchise, around my age at least, are fans precisely because they grew up playing Mech Warrior, or maybe Mech Commander or Mech Assault. Hell, I didn't even know Mech Assault was a BattleTech game until many years later. So in the wake of that, 2018 has brought us BattleTech, a tactical strategy game by Harebrained Schemes, the very same studio behind the Shadowrun revival, and this is the first game in the BattleTech universe since 2013's Mech Warrior Online. And I'll be honest here, if there was any studio that was fit to bring this franchise back into the spotlight, it would be the one co-founded by the board game's original creator. So this team has some pedigree here. And it really shows too. The game is pretty great. It's a satisfying strategy game that effectively gamifies mech warfare in a neo-feudalistic science fiction universe. Speaking as someone who isn't overly familiar with the BattleTech universe but did spend a couple of weeks before the launch of the game just binging on its source material, I say it's a solid translation of what you would expect a video game based on a miniatures game to be. It's got a number of issues, but I think that the game is a great way to introduce the franchise to a new audience while at the same time appealing to hardcore fans. The game is teeming with references and writing that's fit to make any veteran feel right at home, name-dropping noble houses and organizations like they're common knowledge, mostly because to the characters in the game, that's exactly what they are. But for those of you who don't know the difference between the Capellan Confederation and the Federated Sons, or what Comstar is, the game has glossary terms highlighted in yellow that gives you a quick crash course if you hover your mouse over it. It's a nifty way of easing the player into a deeper lore without an exposition dump. It helps that the game's narrative is framed in such a way that makes it easy to pick up on the political structure of the world you're stepping into. You play as the commander of a mercenary company who gets drafted into fighting a war with an overthrown noble trying to reclaim their lost throne. It's a paint-by-numbers revenge story peppered in with family drama, because the best way to get ahead when you're a noble is to backstab your own family members. And largely, this story works, if you choose to follow it. See, the way that it's told is through a system of priority missions that appear either on a timer or after you've completed a number of other missions in between. And you're entirely free to ignore them if you want, focusing instead on flying around the galaxy and taking up a myriad of procedurally generated jobs at your leisure. They're not exactly side quests as much as they are mission board tasks, if that makes sense. And that's fine, but considering that the game was built around this idea of the story about a disparaged noble trying to reclaim their birthright, those missions tend to be far more interesting than any of the other missions available in the game. The story also progresses in a linear fashion, meaning that there aren't really any ways to manipulate it. Choice and consequence have definitely taken a back seat here, with dialogue options and character backgrounds that seem to act more like window dressing than actually offering branching paths. On the surface of it, this isn't really a deal breaker, but it does make me wonder why things like character customization and the ability to choose your upbringing and background were even included, if they're ultimately meaningless. I know this isn't an RPG, but when I see a dialogue system, I sort of expect to be able to use it to affect the game in a meaningful sort of way, even on a small scale. You sort of get this with random events that pop up as you travel around, but with the exception of a few minor rewards such as morale or a tech point boost, they're, again, mostly just added for flavor. Most missions include optional and hidden objectives, which serve as an opportunity to increase the payout of your contract should you choose to complete them. Missions are mostly contained. They're vehicles to bring you into combat situations, and they don't really offer any rewards outside of the tangible resources that you require in order to keep your company afloat, with the exception of a reputation boost from the faction that assigned you the job in the first place. This reputation, however, doesn't really serve a purpose outside of allowing you to pursue some of the more lucrative and dangerous missions that are only offered if the given faction likes you enough. It seems to me that these were ideas that the developers really wanted to expand on, but were forced to cut down as the project came closer and closer to completion. Which is fine because the meat and potatoes of the game more than makes up for it. It's just a shame to see that the skeleton of what looks to be a cool system just become largely superficial. So if you're looking to get into this game for an epic tale where you can immerse yourself as a dashing mercenary captain, who's looking to choose sides in a war and have deep interactions with a wide cast of characters, this probably won't be the game for you. But if you're looking for a solid tactical combat game with a wide variety of units and loadout customizations and you really like explosions, oh man, BattleTech has you covered there. BattleTech feels like a digital board game in all of the right ways. It offers deeply satisfying tactical combat with a huge number of variables that keeps every engagement a fresh new challenge. Despite doing the same general 4 mission types over and over again, each one presented different obstacles that I had to overcome. The procedurally generated maps help here, but things like base defenses, the presence of enemy reinforcements, or even the types of mechs that the enemy fields all factor into approaching each mission differently. Even the kinds of mechs that the enemy spawns are semi-random. Your intel going into a mission is limited. You'll get a few tidbits here and there, like the type of planet you're landing on and the best guess at the sort of resistance that you're facing, but ultimately it's up to you to plan for and adapt to the situations that unfold before your eyes. It keeps you on your toes, and despite being somewhat repetitive, it manages to really keep you engaged. BattleTech's combat runs deep. In a genre where superior positioning makes a difference between victory and defeat, BattleTech takes things a step further. Sure, the standard rules apply. You get bonus to your hit percentage when you're on higher elevation, and all weapons have a minimum and maximum range. But BattleTech factors in a number of other different systems that elevate the stakes. Your mech could be knocked over if it takes too much stability damage, and standing on uneven terrain makes this more likely to happen. This results in your mech going down a peg on the initiative counter and your pilot taking an injury. And if your pilot takes enough injuries, they can become incapacitated or even die. This means that you don't necessarily have to destroy a mech to remove it from play. What's more, each mech has different types of armor on different body parts, and each one sustains damage separately. That means that not only can body parts be destroyed, but that continually hitting a mech in the same general area is a viable strategy to increase the chances of that happening, and thus make them less useful in combat. Not only is your general positioning important therefore, but the direction you're facing becomes absolutely critical as well. Of course, much of that depends on the type of mech that it is. There are 4 different categories: light, medium, heavy, and assault, with assault mechs carrying the most weight and being the biggest. As you can imagine, the bigger they are, the harder they punch, at least generally speaking. On top of that, each individual model of mech has different things that they're good at, like a medium-sized mech that fills in the role of striker cavalry versus one that's a brawler, or a heavy mech that's a long-range sniper versus one that's a general assault mech. The kind of mechs that you choose to bring on a particular mission, along with their loadouts and the stats of the pilots controlling them, can make a big difference on whether or not a mission will be a cakewalk or a death march. Mechs are measured by weight in combination of both weapons and armor, meaning that the bigger the mech, the more weapons it can carry. But this also means that all mechs, even light ones, are highly customizable. All you need to do is sacrifice your armor in order to carry more weight and weapons. It's quite easy to build a glass cannon of a mech with very little tonnage dedicated to armor or heat sinks in order to maximize its weapon systems, assuming that the individual parts allow for them, since some components only allow certain weapon types or are limited in slots. Or even if you skip out on the weapons and make a melee-focused juggernaut, that's entirely possible too. And that's not even taking into consideration all the other things you need to be mindful of on the battlefield. Things like managing your mech's heat output as you fire weapon salvos, how the planet can affect your mech's ventilation, reserving your movement to react to your enemies, your pilot's special abilities, using your jump jets to fly around the map, evasion and distance, melee attacks. The amount of options presented to you during battle are vast, and the sound of missiles crashing into frames of steel and seeing them rip apart to expose the enemy mech's structural frame creates intense moments of sheer visceral joy. But all of this tactical complexity also lends itself to what may very well be the biggest fault that the game has. And that's that it's slow. It's very, very slow, even when compared to other turn-based tactics games. Each side takes a turn moving their units individually while taking shots at one another in order to whittle down their health. And these mechs can take a beating. Ultimately, that means long, drawn-out encounters where attrition becomes the de facto strategy for most every battle. Missions can take anywhere from a half hour to complete to over an hour, depending on how well you assess your threats and how lucky your dice rolls are. The slow combat isn't really helped at all by the sweeping dynamic camera angles that, while they look very impressive, add extra time to every action. And sometimes they don't translate particularly well with the terrain. Oftentimes you'll get stuck between a rock or a cliff face and the action between the mechs is covered up. Or it will pull away from an attack so far that it obfuscates the results because the text appears off screen. It's not an ideal situation, and it loses a lot of its mystique when you've already sunk about 20 hours into the game. Luckily, they can all be turned off and tweaked a little bit from the game's option menu, And a recent post by the developer on the game's Steam page suggests that this is one of the areas that they're intending to address with their upcoming content updates, along with customization options for your pilots, something that's missing at the time of writing this review, and bug and stability fixes. And lordy, does this game need some bug fixing and general performance stability. For an indie game that looks decent, but not breathtaking by any stretch of the imagination, it taxes my system a fair bit more than it should, frankly. And I'm rocking a GTX 1070. That's not to say it's unplayable, far from it, but the amount of processing resources that it uses are actually very surprising. I've also had the game crash on me a couple times when booting up, and I've run into a couple of glitches, the most amusing of which is this walking animation bug that you're looking at right now. The worst offender, however, is probably the exceedingly long load times that you have to wait through when basically doing anything. Loading save games, jumping into missions, it's all rather excessive. It's even worse if you're a save scummer, and Lord knows I'm not judging you, but loading up your save game during a mission doesn't bring you back to the mission itself. Instead, it loads the preparation screen prior to the mission, presumably to give the game a chance to randomly generate its assets, before dropping you into the mission proper. I can only imagine that this would be a much bigger problem on older systems, but again, the developers have stated that they intend to address this, so keep an eye out for it. So whether or not BattleTech is worth your time and money is entirely up to whether or not you have the stomach for slow, methodical battles that have a lot of variables. I think that the game is a wonderful and solid strategy game that offers enough depth and complexity to appeal to fans of tactics games, and its options for customizing your units and your approach to battle strategies is excellent. Its story may be so-so and it's a bit cliched, but there's a real joy to be found in a chess game between mech warriors as you shed blood for cold, hard cash. If you're a fan of tabletop miniatures games, then this is a game that you probably don't want to miss out on. Just don't expect high-octane action. This is definitely more of a slow burn.